I'm sorry, very good. To the honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to be in the House today to speak to the NDP motion, which is drawing a straight line between inequalities that existed before the pandemic, the situation that so many Canadians find themselves in, exacerbated by whether it's poverty or people living with disabilities or seniors or Indigenous people that face particular challenges in a pandemic context, right through to the question of how we build a better Canada on the other side. And all these things are connected, Mr. Speaker. So I've had occasion to talk in the House before about some of the very real challenges that Canadians are facing right now in the midst of this pandemic. Some of those challenges come from before the pandemic and have just been made worse by the pandemic. Some of them are new problems. And when we're trying to solve those problems, we should be thinking about how we emerge from this on the other side in a much better state and with much less inequality between Canadians. And so one of the groups that I want to speak to that I haven't had the opportunity to speak to or about in the House so far, but I want to raise it as an example of how we can respond to a current crisis and then build for better on the other side, is the example of independent travel agents who have faced real challenges through this pandemic because a lot of their income is earned on commission. And of course, that commission doesn't get paid until their clients take their trip, and they found themselves without income, supporting a lot of their clients who have had to make alternative arrangements, mostly cancellations of their travel, have been frustrated at the fact that they can't get the airlines to reimburse their money. And now, in some cases, airlines are offering reimbursements, but contingent on the travel agents sending their commission back to the airlines so that it can be returned to the customers. And so here we have a situation where there's a lot of hardworking people, very, very frustrated, continuing to do work, getting by on CERB and now the CRB, who are looking to have an extended coverage because they know they're not, even when they go back to work and when people start booking travel again, they're not going to see money for a very long time because it isn't until those trips are taken that the commissions start coming in. Now, what is the significance of this? Well, first of all, they're calling for a special extension on their part because of their circumstances for the CRB to apply for them. And that's something that makes a lot of sense given the nature of their industry. Why? Because we want to make sure that Canadians get through this and come out on the other side and don't lose their home as a result of this, so the economy can get back up going as quickly as possible and with a minimum of disruption. But if we had in place already a policy for a guaranteed livable basic income for every Canadian, this transition would have been a lot smoother. And it's something that we should be looking at doing, Mr. Speaker, because before the pandemic, there were far too many Canadians living in poverty. And after the pandemic, there will continue to be Canadians who have need of assistance in order to be able to live with the dignity that every human being deserves. And so when we look at responding to the current challenges of the pandemic, I just gave one small example where there's serious need, and we talk about building for a better future, there's no question that a guaranteed livable basic income has to be part of that solution, and that's part of the motion today. Another important problem that the pandemic has highlighted is the trouble that so many Canadians have getting access to pharmaceutical drugs. And that's been exacerbated by the pandemic because many people who were able to get that access by way of a benefit plan at work, when they lost their job as a result of the pandemic, also lost their drug coverage. And I think that is another example of how one of the real needs of the pandemic for all those Canadians who had drug coverage and now do not because of a loss of employment, that's a problem that we need to address. The many Canadians who didn't have drug coverage prior to the pandemic and continue to live through this pandemic without drug coverage, that's a problem that needs to be addressed. And the way to do that is not a temporary fix, but building a proper public, universal, national pharmacare plan that will cover everybody, irrespective of their employment status, so that when there are large economic upheavals, whether they're because of a pandemic or whether because they're or if they're the result of some other kind of economic downturn, people can rely on their national pharmacare plan in order to be able to get the medication that they need, and they're not beholden to economic circumstances in order to get basic health care, which is something that has been the case with respect to pharmaceutical drugs for far too long here in Canada, and something that we absolutely need to change. One of the other problems that, again, existed before the pandemic but has gotten worse, and I think threatens to get even worse yet, is the question of affordable housing in Canada and ensuring that everybody can put a roof over their head. And that has something to do with income. I think that a guaranteed livable basic income could help with that in terms of ensuring that people have income to pay rent. But the other piece of that puzzle is investment, meaningful investment in public housing of the kind that we saw in the post-war years, and we really haven't seen since the 90s. There has been some new investment in public housing in the last 5 years, but it hasn't gotten us back to the point where provinces and organizations can engage in a consistent planning cycle over the long term. So restoring that capacity is something that's very important. But I want to make sure that I reserve time for what I think is probably the most important part of this motion, because we can talk about all the things that all the ways that we want to support Canadians in living a good life and living with dignity. But we do have to address the question of how it is that those things get paid for. Now, I want to recall, I want members of the House to recall my colleague from Winnipeg Centre who spoke just before me, who said, if you want to save money, the way to do that is to look after people. It's to care for people. And remind members of the House that actually we already pay a huge cost for not doing these things up front. We pay them later. We pay those costs in emergency rooms, and we pay them in jails because people who aren't well looked after end up interacting with the justice system and end up interacting with the healthcare system instead of proactively with their family doctor. They do it reactively in the emergency room once the problem has gotten so bad that they have no choice but to present to the emergency room. So I want to first of all say that when you make these kinds of investments, I believe, and it's not just an article of faith, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker now, there is a lot of evidence to show that you can realize serious cost savings to the public purse over time if you make these investments up front. But the really critical piece about this motion is to say that one of the ways that we can pay for these things is, first of all, to recognize that since the pandemic began, Canada's billionaires are $37 billion richer than they were in March 2020. These are people that can afford to pay more in order to ensure that the rest of Canada is able to get the support that they need. And asking those folks to pay more isn't a stretch. It's not too much to ask. Not only is there nothing wrong with it, there's something deeply wrong with a situation where we don't ask them to pay their fair share. And for far too long, Canada's richest families and largest corporations have been paying lower or assessed at lower tax rates. They've been given options to funnel their money out of the country, not illegally, legally. They can do this legally, Madam Speaker, and invest their money in tax havens. It's why the NDP has proposed a wealth tax on fortunes of over $20 million. It's why we've proposed a temporary excess profit tax for the pandemic, looking at corporations that have made vastly more money since the pandemic began than they did last year, and to say that they should pay a larger share of tax on those profits over and above what they made in previous years. And that's how we're going to go from addressing the inequalities that existed before the pandemic, were exacerbated by the pandemic, and land ourselves in a Canada that is more fair and better to live in for everybody on the other side. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Beaches East York.
Thanks very much, Madam Speaker. And I guess I want to narrow in specifically on how the revenues generated from the two proposed taxation measures square with the spending priorities. And is the idea here that, and is the assumption from the NDP that all of these things can be paid for by these two measures, or is the idea more reasonably these would generate over 5.6 billion, because we know that would be from the wealth tax and obviously some more from the excess profits tax, and that these would then go to these measures, but eyes wide open, they wouldn't pay for these measures in full, because these measures certainly would cost more than that.
A member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I thank the member for the question. I mean, look, Canada is spending a lot of money right now, and I don't think there's a way in this moment to raise the money that you would need in order to be able to pay for all of the things that we need to do. But we're in a time that demands a serious response by government. I believe that these are things that once we're operating in a normal economy, if it's a meaningful priority of the government, that we can find ways to pay for these things. And I think we have a lot of suggestions as to how you can go about doing that. But we're not suggesting today that there's a silver bullet to be able to pay for the entire pandemic relief. Like all governments across the globe, governments are spending a lot of money right now in order to keep our basic economic system afloat so that we can hope to come out on the other side. When we do, I mean, some of these things like a national pharmacare plan, for instance, that's all about saving money. That doesn't cost a dime more than we're already spending as a country on prescription drugs. So, I mean, some of these things don't actually cost money. It's just about organizing the way we purchase them in a different way in order to realize savings, $4 billion a year in the case of a national pharmacare plan.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just to carry on that same line of thinking, I'm a little bit confused that these things don't cost us anything. And I guess maybe just to put some numbers to this, I'm a numbers guy. 5.6 billion of revenue coming from this tax, okay. Dental care, I believe the PBO has costed your program at 1.5 billion, okay. Pharmacare, the PBO has said 19 billion. Universal basic income is a big number. Fraser Institute said at least 131 billion. These are big, big numbers. And so you don't just create money out of nothing. And so your motion seems to assume that the revenues generated will allow you to pay for these programs plus a right to housing, which I didn't even add in here. And I'd just like you to comment on where this money is supposed to come from.
I just want to remind the member that he's to address the questions and comments to the chair, but I'm not the one that will respond to that. So just in the language that's being asked, the honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, sure. I mean, I would encourage that member to read the rest of the PBO report. It says that program would cost the federal government $19 billion. It also says that Canadians as a whole, and conservatives like to remind people all the time, there's only one taxpayer. Canadians as a whole are already paying $24 billion a year on prescription drugs. So to go from a system that we're currently in, where we pay $24 billion for the prescription drug needs of the entire country, to a system where we pay $19 or $20 billion a year. I know the member said he's a numbers guy. If he does that simple subtraction, he'll find that that's actually a far cheaper way of providing prescription drugs to everybody. And that would be doing it in a way that doesn't require them to have a job with an employer that has a prescription drug plan. So it would be far superior. So I encourage the member not just to kind of do the superficial scan of Fraser Institute numbers on these things, but to actually do some homework.
Time for brief questions. The honourable member for Kings Hands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate my member opposite for his speech today. There's been a lot of talk in this House around comparing it to World War II and some of the measures that the government had put in place at that time. I mean, I would ask the member, it was a different time when the economy was booming, where there were certain industries that were certainly benefiting from massive government investment. This is a time where government is putting lots of money to try to stabilize the situation. In terms of the profiteering, what particular industries does he think we need to make sure we're putting further regulations on, or his party?
Our member for Elmwood Transcona, a brief answer, please.
Well, I don't think it has the same moral dimension as people who are profiteering off of the war, but I do think there are industries that if you look at their profits from last year and you look at their profits from this year are much higher. Some grocery companies, for instance, like Galen Weston's fortune has increased substantially since the beginning of the pandemic, and his company has done very well. And so the question is, in terms of what they've made extra this year that they likely wouldn't have made without the pandemic, is do they get to take all that home, or do we say, wow, the country's really struggling and we're looking for ways to pay for the supports we need in order to keep the economy on track, and these are companies that can afford to pay a larger share in these times, and that's the real question.